Often appearing as beacons of hope who represent the triumph of good over evil, the Paladin has become one of the most recognisable and powerful defensive jobs to have graced the Final Fantasy franchise. Able to heal and protect their allies, thwart the undead, and take considerable amounts of punishment, those associated with the Paladin job have also been known to have an altruistic nature. But even though characters like Cecil and Beatrix have served as beacons for what this job represents, over the years, due to inconsistent localization choices, the very definition of the Paladin has become quite muddied. For that reason, this video will also touch upon related jobs such as the Knight, Holy Knight, and Divine Knight, but only where they have contributed to the wider evolution of the Paladin. By doing so, we hope to show that the evolution of the Paladin has been anything but linear, with developers pulling from a variety of sources as they have sought inspiration. And with that disclaimer out of the way, we suggest you strap yourselves in as we are about to explore the complete evolution of Paladins. The term Paladin traces back to 11th century France and the epic poem Song of Roland. It tells the tale of the Battle of Roncesvalles in the year 778, where King Charlemagne's Frankish forces fought the Basque in the Pyrenees Mountains. The Frankish knights were wiped out, but the legend of their defiant last stand lived on for centuries and was immortalised in the Song of Roland, named for their leader. The poem does exaggerate and conflate their legend, turning them into an order of 12 knights, not unlike the Arthurian knights of the Round Table, but it also gives us the term Paladin. It stems from the Palatine Hill in Rome, the mythical site where Rome's founders Romulus and Remus were found. It became the home of Rome's emperors, and the Latin title Palatinus came to refer to the emperor's closest personal retainers. So, the Song of Roland uses the old French derivative Paladin to establish the connection between Charlemagne and the knights who fought at Roncesvalles. Afterwards, the term became synonymous for exemplary, chivalrous knights, perhaps closely connected to their monarch. It spreads as other authors reimagined the Song of Roland, such as the 15th century poem Orlando Furioso, and it became entrenched in medieval literature. And that's where the creators of Dungeons & Dragons found it when developing their influential tabletop role-playing game in the 70s. Gary Gygax was a devout reader of various science fiction, fantasy and medieval tales, and the concept of paladins as exceptional knights transferred into the game world he helped to create. Paladins appeared in Greyhawk, the first supplement for Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition in 1975. They were a subclass of the Fighting Man class, available to characters with high charisma and lawful alignment. They were then refined in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the edition of the game that we believe employees at Square would later draw from. Beyond their fighting abilities, Paladins could heal allies with a touch or with low-level magic. They had innate protection from evil, became nearly invulnerable to magic if using a holy sword, and had some limited holy power themselves. However, knowingly committing any act deemed evil or chaotic would permanently revoke their paladin status unless they confessed and performed penance. This interpretation of the paladin would inspire the makers of The Bard's Tale, a role-playing game for Apple II computers, and a slew of other platforms including the Nintendo Entertainment System. Though it did not see an official release in Japan until 1990, it may have been among the inspirations for Sakaguchi's team when making Final Fantasy. However, paladins in The Bard's Tale were much simpler, with reduced resistance to spell attacks and special conditions. And that brings us to 1987 and the release of the original Final Fantasy. Paladins appeared as simple knights in the original, perhaps due to text restrictions. The knight was an upgrade for the fighter in the same way the paladin was an upgrade for the fighting man in the original Dungeons & Dragons, and players could upgrade their fighters permanently by bringing Bahamut, a rat's tail. Aesthetically, the knight was very similar to the fighter with an older, more mature look. They had access to some of the best weapons and equipment, including the class-exclusive Excalibur, heavy dragon armor, and the Aegis shield. With these three pieces of equipment adorning a knight, they would not only gain elemental resistances, making them strong against magic, but Excalibur would nullify the elemental weaknesses of enemies, as opposed to being the piece of equipment that provided the resistance. Knights also gained access to the first 3 levels of white magic, giving them Cure and Cura, lightning and fire nullification, and both Protect and Blink. Given how enemy attacks were distributed in the original game, these were great spells for the knight to cast upon themselves. The unit in the first party slot had a 50% chance of being targeted for a single target attack, and the unit in the second slot had a 25% chance. It meant the high defensive knights made them the best choice for the first 2 slots of the party, and Blink and Protect would help to prevent the damage that would come at them. Furthermore, white mages may not have taken those spells earlier on in favour of their specific anti-undead and group healing spells, so these spells would help knights to defend themselves. Now, Final Fantasy I made the distinction between the knight and paladin a little bit blurry, but it became much more complicated when the job system returned in Final Fantasy III. And part of this confusion was caused by a job that was going to be known as Paladin being cut during production. It was meant to be obtained from the Earth Crystal as the ultimate warrior type job, but it was instead repurposed into the knight, with the same design even being used. What we then saw was also quite different from how knights were portrayed in the original Final Fantasy, but it did help to provide a bit of separation. This time, there was no association with white magic, and Excalibur was not a class-exclusive weapon. Knights were also restricted from having a unique command ability, but when using Defend, they would only take 1 point of damage. Their support ability, Cover, also allowed them to intercept attacks meant for characters in critical status as opposed to healing them. But even though Holy became an element in this game, there was no association with the knight, and outside of wearing heavy armour, the connection, based on what had been established so far, was loose. Here's where things got interesting though, as there was a knightly job that could use white magic, the Dark Knight. Perhaps benefiting from the decision to cut the Paladin via their command ability, Dark Knights were granted access to low-level white magic, just like knights in the original game. And it meant that in Final Fantasy III, the Paladin's antithesis was in some ways more of a holy knight than the knight itself. It was Final Fantasy IV where the Paladin fully established itself as its own job in Final Fantasy. Just as Kane Highwind defined and popularised the Dragoon, Cecil Harvey provided the first true, uniform version of the Paladin. After Cecil renounced his ways as a Dark Knight at Mount Ordeals to become a Paladin, he served as a true beacon of hope. But it's also where many issues around classification started. Up until this point, we had seen 3 variants of Knight that adopted traits associated with Paladins, albeit from external sources. And it was perhaps because of this that the developers felt it would be inappropriate for Cecil to transition from being a Dark Knight to simply a Knight. As such, they created the Paladin, or Holy Knight, to serve as a much more literal antithesis of the Dark Knight. It would combine all the previous traits associated with Knight and Dark Knight with a holy affinity added to make it more distinctive. As such, Cecil could use Cover, a trait introduced via Knight in Final Fantasy III, and after the transition had modified stats with increased spirit and magic resistance. By level 24, Cecil will gain access to a small set of low-level white magic, including spells such as Cura, Teleport and Asuna, allowing him to not just protect allies through physical actions, but heal and support them through magic as well. And alongside a whole host of weapon types, Cecil could use a new classification of weapon, the Holy Sword. As the name suggested, many of the swords within this categorization, including Excalibur, would be aligned with the holy element, and Cecil's ultimate weapon, Ragnarok, would not only boost a variety of stats, but would also increase damage against the undead. To further this notion, Cecil had exclusive armor, the Crystal Mail, which would grant increased resistance against numerous status ailments including the undead, and the Crystal Shield, which would provide further resistance against the undead. But they weren't the only changes, as Cecil features some other pre-Final Fantasy influences with a specific focus on the narrative. Cecil was of royal blood, serving as one of the king's close personal retainers, and had a strong moral compass, something that led to him questioning the king when his actions strayed from being lawful. All of these traits brought the Paladin to life, but despite Cecil's time in the spotlight, the job did not feature in Final Fantasy V. Instead, focus was placed on the Knight job, which had no access to white magic, but could use the Cover ability with Defend upgraded to Guard. But to further the confusion, Knight now featured a small trait that was just introduced with the Paladin, an affinity with Holy. Excalibur had been exclusive to Knights in the original game, and was then made exclusive to Cecil in Final Fantasy IV, where it was imbued with the Holy element. In Final Fantasy V, Excalibur was made exclusive to Knights yet again, if we ignore freelancers, and its ability to deal holy damage was retained. Further to this, if the player did feel a yearning and had obtained Excalibur, the Paladin job could be constructed by using a knight as a base and taking white magic as the second command. Final Fantasy VI then offered an unorthodox representation of the Paladin, and this came in the form of General Leo Christophe. Serving as a top-ranking soldier in the Gestalian Empire, Leo fulfilled many traits associated with the job, even if he was never explicitly called a Paladin. Much like Cecil, Leo served as the close personal retainer of the ruler, and even though he was a peerless swordsman, Leo also preferred to solve things peacefully if able, even proposing a truce with the Espers, something that meant Leo embodied the righteous morality of the lawful good. Where Leo strayed was in combat, as he functioned more like a standard knight. Acting as a powerhouse, Leo had strong offensive capabilities that were enhanced by the Master's Scroll. He could also use Shock, a powerful command that dealt non-elemental damage to all enemies. But even though Leo had strong defensive capabilities too, and came equipped with the Aegis Shield, there was a lack of any way to protect or heal allies, with no specific defensive commands. Regardless, Leo functioned as sort of an honorary paladin, and when appearing in subsequent games like Record Keeper and Opera Omnia, his moveset was enhanced to reflect that status. With the main series shifting its thematic process throughout the production of Final Fantasy VII, traditional jobs were discarded. But as Final Fantasy Tactics was more deep-rooted in high fantasy, Hiroyuki Ito created a comprehensive job system that featured a plethora of roles, and even though Paladin did not appear in the literal sense, there were plenty of allusions, with Agrias Oaks, Delita, and Vigoroth serving as prominent examples. Each was denoted as either being a Holy Knight or White Knight, a new job that shared similarities with the Paladin job, in much the same way that the Paladin shared similarities with the Knight job. As such, not all traits were inherited, and some new ones were introduced. In the immediate sense, each of the three characters, at some point throughout the story, acted as a retainer for a higher power. Agrias served Avelia, Delita served Ramza, and Rigoroth served Folmarth after his rebellion failed. They each also believed that they were, in what could only be described as a world struggling with morality, taking actions that were lawful, although whether those actions were good or neutral depends on interpretation. From a gameplay perspective, Holy Knights appeared to have a strong affinity with the holy element, and Final Fantasy Tactics leaned hard on their offensive capabilities. Their unique command, called Holy Sword, allowed them to deal heavy elemental damage and various status effects such as Stop, Doom, and Silence. However, in spite of being called Holy Sword, and many descriptions claiming the attacks channeled holy energy, they were not inherently holy elemental. Instead, each move reflected the element of the user's currently equipped sword. In that regard, Holy Knights could use Knight Swords, but they were not exclusive to the job. Nonetheless, the classification contained a range of classic swords associated with the job, including Defender, Excalibur, and Ragnarok, as well as a new addition, Save the Queen. Out of the set, Excalibur was the only weapon to be aligned with Holy, and it allowed the wielder to not only absorb all Holy-based attacks, but also boost Holy damage. And this was a very close alignment to Dungeons & Dragons, where using swords granted magic resistance. Holy Sword also contained an ability called Chant, a defensive move that saw the Holy Knights sacrifice their own health to restore an allies, and alongside this, Holy Knights could also learn Defend, but could not cover their allies. But as with Final Fantasy V, should the player wish to make something more akin to the traditional Paladin, they could use White Magic as a second command. Tactics also introduced a variant class, the Divine Knight, which was assigned to Meliadul, Folmarth, and Lothri. They could equip the same things as Holy Knights, plus crossbows and polearms, and the unique command, Unyielding Blade, dealt damage, broke target armor, and was also associated with the user's currently equipped sword. The interesting twist here though was that like Leo, Meliadul started as an opponent, but after joining the party would come equipped with Save the Queen as well as the Aegis Shield. Final Fantasy VIII followed a similar approach to Final Fantasy VII, but when the Paladin returned to the main series with Final Fantasy IX, it was in a much more traditional form. General Beatrix, much like General Leo and Cecil, served as the close personal retainer of the ruling power, Queen Bran. And in that role, Alexandria was served with a high degree of dignity. That was, until Beatrix felt that Bran no longer had the best interests of Alexandria at heart, leading to a change of allegiance. As an antagonist, Beatrix would be fought against numerous times, but would later join the party as a guest character. and these appearances featured numerous traits associated with the many knights, paladins and holy knights that had come before. In each of the encounters, Beatrix would wield Save the Queen, a weapon introduced in Tactics that would now grant resistance against the fire element. Her main command was called Seiken, the Japanese word for holy sword, and within this command were numerous offensive moves, another clear reference to Tactics. Each ability would deal damage to Beatrix's foes, with the most powerful move, Shock, a move previously exclusive to General Leo, dealing large amounts of physical damage. Alongside Seiken, Beatrix could also use white magic, but unlike previous iterations of the job, even though Beatrix had the quantity of spells restricted, there were no restrictions based on power of spell. This saw Beatrix gain access to top tier spells like Full Life and Holy, which could not even be learnt by Garnet. However, as Beatrix was only a guest character, it was not possible to learn new abilities, and this meant that even though cover was included in the game, Beatrix could not use it. And despite wielding a sword associated with Holy Knights, Beatrix had no affinity with the element outside of being able to cast the spell. Final Fantasy XI released as the first MMO in the franchise, and its basic list of jobs harkened back to the original Final Fantasy. These 6 jobs were then supplemented by 6 advanced jobs, which included Paladin. But to confuse things further, in the Japanese version of the game, Paladin was called Knight, and what we saw was another interpretation of this hybrid job that was very comprehensive. The Paladin Order was founded by the Ulvan race, with current-day Sandoria housing numerous royal knights and temple knights who are trained to protect the monarchy at all costs. 2 of the most senior figures were Tryon, the son of King Destin, who served as the commander of the Royal Knights, and Kurilla, who commanded the Temple Knights and was denoted as the most powerful swordsman in all of Vana'diel. Not only did this last point parallel Beatrix and Leo, but their leadership positions reflected the positions held by Beatrix, Leo, and Cecil, each of whom commanded their kingdom's elite forces. In a practical sense, this iteration of the Paladin was very similar to what had been seen within Final Fantasy IV. Those who adopted the job would be able to heal and protect allies, have increased durability that would enable them to take a high degree of physical and magical punishment, and they would also be aligned with the holy element. But unlike previous iterations, which often relied on equipment to see these traits manifest, in Final Fantasy XI they were baked into the job. One of the first traits unlocked by a Paladin would be Undead Killer. That would provide them with a boost when fighting against undead enemies. They would also learn Holy Circle at the same time, an ability that would grant resistance against undead for the entire party. In addition, Paladins would gain numerous boosts to their defensive stats, would gain resistance against the sleep status effect, and would receive bonuses to protect should they be using a shield. Their toolkit was also expanded beyond just having enhanced defense and being able to provide cover to a specific ally based on their relative position. Invincible, for example, served as a loose nod back to Final Fantasy III, where Defend would reduce all incoming damage to 1, except in Final Fantasy XI, a Paladin using Invincible would become immune to all physical attacks for 30 seconds. Rampart would provide a defensive bonus for the entire party, Fealty would grant a huge boost to enfeebling magic resistance, and other moves such as Palisade and Intervene would improve a Paladin's utility with shield beyond just using their shield bash ability to stun a target. Paladins also had access to a wide array of white magic, which spanned healing, enhancing and divine spells such as Holy. Much like earlier games, they were restricted from gaining access to the top tier spells. However, they did gain access to exclusive spells like Enlight and Reprisal, with Enlight being used to add light damage to physical attacks. And to help with this aspect of the Paladin's role, they also had an ability called Chivalry that would allow them to convert TP into MP. In addition to these traits, spells and abilities, Paladins could be further enhanced via equipment. AF armor would enhance abilities and reduce damage, and there was also an array of exclusive swords that included the likes of Save the Queen and Durandal. Paladin was also granted an exclusive category of elite weapons, the Shield, and the first elite weapon available was the Aegis Shield, a popular choice across the franchise for would-be Paladins. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance then solidified many of the concepts into a clear, defined class with limited ambiguity. This time it was exclusive to the Hume race, and they would again appear as an advanced job, with Soldier serving as its precursor. Their main command was Chivalry, a term only just associated with Paladins in Final Fantasy XI, and housed within was a selection of offensive and defensive moves, each of which would need to be learnt from classic Paladin weapons. Defender, for example, would teach Nurse, an ability that would be used to heal HP and remove negative status effects. Save the Queen would then teach Cover, Ragnarok would teach Drop Weapon, and Excalibur would teach Holy Blade, an ability that dealt holy damage. In addition, the Paladin could also learn Defense, Parley, an ability that would be able to convince an enemy to leave the battlefield, and Saint Cross, another holy-based move. Paladins also had some of the highest defense and magic resistance in the game, and with access to greatswords, it made them very powerful from an offensive perspective as well. This implementation was then replicated within Final Fantasy Tactics A2, but there were a few small differences, such as a new move called Sanctify that would use Holy to banish the undead. When the Final Fantasy III remake released not too long after, there had been plenty of time for the developers to mull over an interesting oversight that had appeared in the original game. It saw the removal of healing abilities from the Dark Knight, with the Knight serving as the beneficiary, and it meant the Knight became more in line with what one might have expected from a Paladin. And it was a similar theme in Final Fantasy FABLES CHOCOBO'S Tales, as even though there was no Paladin job available, the Knight job pulled in some of the classic traits. Learned from Freya's memories, the Knight job featured numerous abilities, but two with interesting names stood out for what they enabled: Aegis and Excalibur. Aegis served as the only defensive move available when using the Knight, as it reduced the damage taken from physical attacks, and Excalibur allowed the Knight to deal a 3-way attack that was imbued with the holy element. Even though Final Fantasy XII had ditched jobs, its successor, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, brought them back, and in the role of the Paladin was Barsch von Ronsenberg. Granted exclusive access to Knight Sword, Barsch could wield Defender, Save the Queen, and Excalibur, swords that had become synonymous with the job. Barsch also had access to a wide array of abilities that included a limited selection of white magic spells like Protect Gar and Shulgar, as well as Cover. Barsch could also use Apocalypse Shield to nullify all damage targeted at the group, and had a move called Chivalry, but there were no curative spells available, and the association with Holy was removed entirely. Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac job system was released not too long after, but in an interesting twist, the game featured the Knight as opposed to the Paladin. And this particular version was aligned well with the Knight from the original Final Fantasy, as through the license board they would have access to heavy armour and swords, while also having access to a limited array of white magic. They also had an exclusive weapon, Excalibur, that was imbued with the holy element, as well as other classic weapons like Defender, Save the Queen and Ragnarok, but they were also shared with white mages and red battle mages. To enhance the Knight and create something closer to a Paladin, much like in Final Fantasy V, it could be supplemented by another job. In this case, either White Mage or Time Battle Mage would improve the array of spells available, as well as the efficiency of those spells. Upon the release of Final Fantasy IV The After Years, even though Cecil did reappear, from a gameplay perspective everything was almost identical. Cecil could still use cover and could use an array of white magic, albeit with a smaller selection available, but with low spirit, using white magic would act more as a last resort than anything more meaningful. These changes were perhaps made due to the inclusion of Ceodor, Cecil's son. Much like Cecil, Ceodor had strong physical attributes and had access to white magic, but the physical side was less pronounced than his father due to greater emphasis being placed on Ceodor's magical capabilities. This granted access to higher tier spells such as Curaga, and cover was replaced by another command called Awaken, which fully restored Ceodor and boosted stats. Cecil then fulfilled the role of Paladin in Dissidia, having been selected as the Warrior of Light to represent Final Fantasy IV. Much like Cecil's Dark Knight, this introduced some interesting twist on what had been established, and outside of this appearance being faithful from a visual perspective, there wasn't much else present that showcased the Paladin job as it had been established, and this remained the same for Cecil's appearances in Dissidia Duodecim and Dissidia NT. Final Fantasy XIII featured 6 different roles, and one of them, the Sentinel, allowed party members to adopt a defensive stance. But despite the role being similar to that of the Paladin, it was nothing more than an illusion, as outside of Snow's ultimate weapon being called Save the Queen, there was no association with Holy, and the only move that bore any resemblance to what had been established was Steel Guard, which enhanced physical and magical resistance. Sentinels could use Provoke, but up until this point it had never been an inherent Paladin skill, and could often only be used as a sub-job byproduct, especially in Final Fantasy XI. And that's an interesting point, as the next comprehensive iteration of the Paladin, which will be found in Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, saw Provoke cemented as a permanent trait. The Paladin crown could be obtained after the defeat of Lucifer, and it would grant the party access to a strong defensive unit that could also deal damage if required. The initial ability, Cover, protected an ally from receiving damage, and the next ability, Bait, was an iteration of Provoke, drawing an enemy's attention to become the target. Their final ability, called Last Stand, would then serve the same function as Invincible, allowing a Paladin to take unlimited punishment for several turns without fear of death. Crystal Defender's Vanguard Storm then took the defensive duty of Paladins to the extreme by having them appear as a unit that could no longer attack. Instead, they would appear as sacrificial lambs used to prevent the enemy from advancing for as long as possible. In Knights of the Crystals, the Paladin appeared as a bronze level job. Its main strength was that attack would be based on damage received, and its abilities, Shimmering Blade and Resist Holy, would deal holy elemental damage and increase resistance against the element. Knights of the Crystals also featured a few other, more advanced Paladin class jobs, such as White Knight, Divine Knight, and the Crystal Knight. They each had the same gameplay mechanics, but the potency of their abilities was enhanced, with Crystal Knight serving as the strongest variant, perhaps a nod back to Final Fantasy IV where Cecil donned crystal armour. Crystal Knight also ditched Holy Resistance in favour of Zen stance, which would improve attack and physical defence. Final Fantasy Dimensions featured the Paladin as a job that could be obtained during the 7th chapter of the game, and it served as a defensive extension of the warrior. The command was Holy Blade, a variant of Holy Sword, and it contained a host of familiar abilities including Cover and Guard, as well as Ivory Slash, a move that would deal light elemental damage to a single target. Alongside this, Paladins gained access to Mighty Guard, a recurring spell that increased physical and magical resistance to all allies but had never before been associated with the job. They also had near-exclusive access to Holy Swords, with Jobless being the only other role capable of wielding them, and within this categorization were typical weapons such as Defender, Save the Queen, Excalibur, and Ragnarok. Each weapon had Holy Elemental alignment, and Excalibur received a damage boost when fighting against the undead. And that brings us on to Final Fantasy XIV. Much like Final Fantasy XI, even though the Western version of Final Fantasy XIV featured Paladins as a prominent defensive job, in the Japanese version they are known as Knights. Appearing as an evolution of the Gladiator class, Paladins would act as one of the 4 tank roles available in Final Fantasy XIV, and what we have seen was built upon what was established in Final Fantasy XI, while also deviating away from some of the established norms. Many centuries ago, Paladins served as loyal defenders of the Uldar royal line as members of the Sultan Sworn, the personal guard of the Sultan. The order was formed by Sasagan or Sisagan under the guidance of Jarl Tristram, and alongside Tristram there were 2 other founding members who were each granted legendary blades that were forged from the Oathkeeper, a sacred sword. These blades were Cortana, Joyus, and Durandal, each of which appeared in Final Fantasy XI, but none of them were exclusive to the Paladin, and only the latter had any real association, having sporadically appeared as an exclusive weapon in only a handful of games over the years. In the present day, Paladins still existed within the Sultan Sworn, but they were not the sole representatives, and those who became Free Paladin were tasked with upholding tradition, travelling across the land, and standing up for those who were unarmed and defenceless. To do so, Paladins would have access to swords, shields, and heavy armour. Within those categorizations, there was a high degree of commonality between Final Fantasy XI and XIV, with weapons such as Bertgang, Honorbound, and the Aegis Shield returning. Excalibur was also made exclusive in Final Fantasy XIV, as opposed to being shared with Red Mages in XI, but other classics like Defender, Ragnarok, and Save the Queen were no longer associated with Paladins. In combat, Paladins would have the highest defense, but would offer the lowest consistent damage output. This was because many of their abilities and weapon skills were based around assisting others, and many of the abilities were borrowed from Final Fantasy XI. It would see the return of Shield Bash, Iron Will, Sentinel, Cover, Chivalry, Holy Circle, and Rampart, although despite some of them having the same name, application was changed. Iron Will, for example, was changed from being a trait that would enhance Rampart to being the job gauge that would be associated with Enmity and the usage of abilities such as Sheltron, Cover, and Intervention, abilities that would be paramount to aiding the party and reducing damage dealt to others. And perhaps one of the more prominent changes for the job was evidenced with Holy Circle, as instead of increasing resistance against attacks from the undead, it now dealt damage and restored HP to the user, something that signified a complete disassociation between Paladins, the holy element, and the undead. These changes, as well as the job acting as an extension of the gladiator, had led to there being qualms about a lack of identity for paladins in 14, as they didn't have a specific function outside of just taking the least damage, and that resulted in there being a complete rework for Endwalker, which has addressed some of those concerns. While much of this evolution of the Paladin in 14 was happening, Paladin also appeared in numerous other games, the first of which was Final Fantasy XIII-2. Not included in the base game, Paladin was added as an exclusive role for Lightning via the Requiem of the Goddess DLC scenario, but even though the Paladin name was used, the role performed more like an amended commando than Sentinel, with the majority of moves and passive abilities focused around dealing damage as opposed to mitigating it. Final Fantasy Brigade also featured the Paladin, which appeared as an advanced job that could be accessed after White Mage and Monk were leveled up sufficiently. This represented the first time Paladin had been associated with Monk as opposed to a more traditional sword-wielding job, and it served as a point of confusion when the game was released. Nonetheless, Paladins used large swords and magic-based abilities, and their appearance was very similar to that of Cecil Harvey. Bravely Default, acting as a close cousin to Final Fantasy, included numerous jobs, and in the case of Paladin, it was somewhat split down the middle between two jobs, Templar, also known as Holy Knight, and Knight. From a narrative perspective, Brave was the most prominent example of a Templar, but unlike previous named characters who fulfilled the role, Brave was the ruler, as opposed to being the protector of the ruler. He was also believed to be the main antagonist, but his actions could still be construed as noble. When using the Templar job, players would gain access to a physical class that boasted excellent defensive and offensive capabilities, and many of those offensive abilities, accessible via the Holy Arts command, were aligned with the light element. They also had access to enhanced guard and rampart, further aligning them with the classic view of the Paladin. But Knight also featured some clear traits. Their command was called Chivalry, and it featured a variant of cover called Protect Ally, as well as an enhanced version called Fully Cover. This could then be enhanced further if coupled with Chivalrous Spirit. Knights also gained a boost to their shield aptitude, and it meant that if the two were combined, it would have created a near-complete version of the Paladin. The job next appeared as a garb in Lightning Returns. This was imbued with the soul of the Holy Knight, increasing Lightning's magic and debuff resistance, and offering access to Heavy Guard, as well as Ruingar Guard, an ability that would counterattack with magic damage after absorbing attacks, a weird throwback to Knights of the Crystals. But while this appearance served as a nice illusion, when Final Fantasy Explorers arrived, Paladin was given a much stronger showing, even if some of the more established moves were again associated with the Knight job as well. To unlock the Paladin, players would need to have crafted 15% of all available equipment, as opposed to defeating a boss or completing a mission. They had very high defense, but average stats elsewhere, and in an interesting twist, Paladins had some of the worst magic defense. They could, however, use a command called Sanctuary, which increased resistance against status effects and increased their malice, a nod to enmity pooling in Final Fantasy XI and XIV. Paladins could also use Cover, which would see the creation of a barrier that could protect allies, but they could not use magic, and there was no association with Holy, making them feel more like a knight. But the game also featured the Knight job. They also had high defense and average stats elsewhere, and their abilities were Provoke, which would taunt an enemy, as well as Chivalry, which would increase their parry rate. Both moves would also increase malice, making the job very similar to Paladin, just with a slightly different execution. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 continued the trend of including Knight and Paladin, with them both featuring elements seen from the ambiguously named job in Final Fantasy XI when called upon as Eidolons. Both wore grandiose white armour, with the Knight wearing a variant that was very similar to AF armour featured in Final Fantasy XI, and Paladins wearing a variant of Cecil's armour from Dissidia. When summoned, they would both use Sentinel, something that allowed all party members to negate a single attack, but Paladins could also be used to teach Holy Blade. The Paladin next appeared in MOBIUS as a job card that featured as part of Job Batch 5. Paladins were classified as a warrior-type job, with them fulfilling the role of defender in the game's multiplayer segment. They could also wield Save the Queen and their ultimate move called Runic Saber, while offering some defensive boosts. In addition, Mobius also featured the Eorzean Paladin, a representation of the Paladin from Final Fantasy XIV as it appeared in Heaven's Ward. As such, they wielded the katana, and their ultimate ability, Circle of Scorn, dealt light damage to all foes. Brave EXVIUS featured many knights, but paladins were rare, with Sylvie featuring as one of the few with the distinction. In this role, Sylvie would be able to increase light resistance for all allies, as well as adding light elemental damage to all upcoming attacks. She could also use abilities to mitigate all incoming damage and had access to an array of high-tier white magic. Alongside Sylvie, players could also acquire Cecil, who again had a strong association with the light element and had numerous abilities that could be used to protect allies. Cecil would again represent the Paladin in Opera Omnia, although much like in the other Dissidia games, it was only a loose representation due to there being more focus on offensive play. In this role, Cecil would be able to use numerous holy elemental attacks and could use Light Enchant to add holy enchantment to the entire party. Holy Flame and Luminous Shard would also deal a ton of damage, but would have the added bonus of significantly raising the party's defensive stats. And that brings us on to War of the Visions. Unlike its predecessor, where the Paladin job was seldom used, War of the Vision featured numerous Paladins, with the likes of Engelbert, Nasher, Ravies, and Titas all being represented. There were also numerous characters that featured Paladin as a sub-job, including Agrius and Delita from Tactics, and also Tidus, an interesting choice considering his animation was used in 14 for the Paladin job. Cecil also featured, but was given the unique job of Lunar Paladin. Each of them had a selection of offensive holy-based moves, as well as defensive moves. Among them would be Sentinel and Paladin Guard, which would be used to raise defense, as well as Immortal Spirit, which would allow them to survive fatal damage. When using Paladin as a sub-job, characters would also gain access to Taunting Blade, further building upon the association between Provoke and the Paladin job. All things considered, it meant that Paladin had a solid showing in War of the Visions, and it serves as a fitting end for this rather lengthy evolutionary study. Unlike many of the other jobs we featured, over the years there has been a significant degree of cannibalization amongst the Knight, Paladin, and Holy Knight. Established traits have often been shared between the three, and it has somewhat diluted the impact of each specific job. But we hope you've enjoyed this retrospective view nonetheless, and if you did, please consider giving us a like. We'd also like to hear what job class you would like us to tackle next, so be sure to let us know in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe as well, as there are plenty of jobs that we are planning to cover throughout 2022. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Anthony Hoffman and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I hope you all have a wonderful new year, and I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.